On the morning of August 12th, 2015, a story began to unfold in the quiet town of Willow Creek, Kansas. That would forever blur the line between desperation and divine providence. Willow Creek wasn't the kind of place people expected headlines to emerge from. A town of barely 4,000 souls. It sat surrounded by golden wheat fields and long stretches of dusty highway. The town had its routines, its small joys, its Sunday services. People here believed in hard work, in keeping their struggles private, and in making do with whatever they had. And yet, behind one modest two-bedroom house on Maple Street, a family was being pushed to the edge of survival. Sarah Miller, once a bright-eyed accountant with a steady job, now found herself standing in her small kitchen, opening cupboards that were bare. Her husband, David, a carpenter by trade, had not held a steady paycheck in nearly a year. His woodworking shop, once the pride of his hands, had gone up in flames the winter before. The insurance company had stalled, questioned, denied. The Millers had fought back at first, but lawyers cost money they no longer had. Their 3 children, Emily, age 12, Jacob, 9, and little Lily, just 4 years old, were too young to grasp the full weight of what their parents were carrying, but not too young to feel the ache in their stomachs. The oldest, Emily, had begun making excuses at school, claiming she liked wearing the same hoodie every day, even as the sleeves grew short. Jacob had learned to silence his complaints, though at night he pressed his hands to his belly, whispering that it hurt. Lily, with all the blunt honesty of a child, asked again and again when breakfast would be ready, even when there was nothing left to cook. For 3 days, nothing of substance had passed through that family's mouth. A can of beans, a heel of bread, watered-down broth stretched to seem like soup. That was all that had kept them going. Neighbors noticed the small changes. A local cashier remembered Sarah once buying snacks for the kids. Now she bought only the cheapest flour and rice, if she bought anything at all. David, who once carried himself tall with sawdust on his shirt, was now seen walking the streets, knocking on doors, asking farms and construction sites if they needed extra hands. He was turned away almost everywhere. And then came the moment that would crack open their private suffering for the world to see. On that August afternoon, Sarah gathered her 3 children and walked them hand in hand toward St. Joseph's Church on Main Street. For years, she had avoided asking for help, determined to weather every storm with dignity, but the hunger in her children's eyes had become unbearable. Her pride had to yield to something greater, the desperate instinct of a mother to keep her family alive. Those who saw her that day remembered the image vividly. A woman pale from worry, her hair tied back hastily, walking with 3 small children who shuffled quietly by her side. Emily carried Lily's doll. Jacob clutched his mother's hand as if afraid she might vanish. They weren't loud. They weren't crying. But there was something in their silence that told of exhaustion too deep for words. When Sarah reached the rectory door and rang the bell, Father Michael, the parish priest, was finishing his afternoon rest. He would later recall that the moment he opened the door, he felt something shift in the air. A heaviness, but also a call. He saw the hollow cheeks of the children, the trembling in Sarah's hands as she tried to speak, and he knew this was no ordinary parish visit. "Father," she said, her voice breaking, "we haven't eaten in 3 days. My children are hungry. I don't know where else to go." Those words, carried on a whisper, would set in motion a chain of events no one in Willow Creek could have predicted. A family at their lowest point, a mother forced to surrender her pride, and a community about to witness something they would one day call a miracle. And if you are listening to this story now, remember what happened to the Millers was not just about food on a table. It was about the unseen hand that sometimes moves in the silence of despair, revealing itself in ways science cannot explain and logic cannot contain. Stay with us until the end, because what happened next inside a small American home with peeling paint and creaking floors would change not only one family's fate, but the faith of an entire town. Before the hunger set in, the Millers were like so many families in small-town America. They lived in a modest two-bedroom house on Maple Street, a home with faded blue siding, and a backyard just big enough for a swing set, and a patch of tomatoes Sarah tried to grow every summer. For years, theirs had been a story of quiet stability. David Miller had built his reputation with his hands. For nearly 15 years, he worked as a carpenter, specializing in handcrafted cabinets in antique restorations. His small workshop, converted from an old barn behind their house, had become a hub for neighbors and even clients from nearby towns. People said he had the old touch, the kind of craftsmanship you couldn't buy in big box stores. On weekends, you could hear the hum of his saw, the tap of his hammer, and his apprentices learning to shape oak and walnut under his steady eye. Sarah, with her degree in accounting, handled the business side. She balanced invoices, managed taxes, and made sure every check from clients was deposited on time. More than that, she raised their 3 children with a calm steadiness. Emily, the eldest, inherited her mother's thoughtful eyes. Jacob had David's curiosity, always tinkering with scraps of wood in the shop. Little Lily was the family's heartbeat, the toddler who filled the house with laughter. For a long time, their life felt ordinary, secure, but ordinary can unravel quickly. It started with a single phone call in late 2024. A property developer out of Wichita, who owed David's workshop over $40,000 for a large custom kitchen job, declared bankruptcy overnight. Months of labor vanished into paperwork and empty promises. The Millers tightened their belts, assuming they would bounce back. But then January brought disaster. On a bitterly cold night, a spark in the workshop's wiring turned into flames. By the time the fire department arrived, the barn was an inferno. Every machine, saws, sanders, planers, was reduced to twisted metal. The wood David had stockpiled for years, rare maple and cherry, turned to ash. He stood in the snow, his children clinging to Sarah's coat, and watched his livelihood collapse. The sharp crackle of ancient timbers mixing with the acrid smell of charred maple and burnt dreams. Insurance adjusters came, took photos, filed reports. Weeks passed, then months. The letters came back full of legal terms and denials, unverified cause, potential negligence. The claim was delayed, then disputed, then effectively erased. Without tools, David couldn't take new jobs. By March, he was officially unemployed. Sarah tried to step in. She polished her resume and sent it to accounting firms in Wichita, Topeka, even Kansas City. But she was 37 with a 7-year gap in her employment history from raising children. Rejections filled her inbox. "We've chosen another candidate. Thank you for your application." Each email felt like a door slamming shut. The savings went fast. Mortgage payments, utilities, groceries. They drained what little cushion the Millers had built. By June, bills piled up unopened on the kitchen counter. The electric company sent warnings. The gas bill doubled. They sold their used minivan. Then Sarah's wedding ring. then antique furniture David had once restored himself. Neighbors began to notice the strain. The kids no longer rode bikes to the park. Sarah walked to the grocery store with exact change in her hand. David knocked on doors, offering to repair fences or mow lawns for $20. A proud craftsman was now reduced to odd jobs that barely covered a loaf of bread. Emily started lying to classmates, telling them her shoes with the worn-out soles were her favorite pair. Jacob, once full of questions, grew quiet at the dinner table. Lily, too young to understand economics, simply cried for food her parents couldn't give. By July, the line between survival and collapse blurred. Sarah began cleaning houses under the table, scrubbing floors for cash that barely bought cereal. David tried his luck at nearby farms, offering to help with early harvest, but farmers shook their heads. Sorry, not hiring. Maybe next season. At night. Husband and wife sat at their kitchen table in silence, staring at stacks of overdue bills. I feel like we're sinking, Sarah whispered once, tears streaking her face. And no one even sees us. David took her hand, but the calluses that once symbolized strength now trembled with defeat. Pride kept them from asking for help sooner. They attended church quietly every Sunday at St. Joseph's, dressed neatly, smiling politely. Few knew that the Millers often skipped breakfast to make sure their kids could eat. Father Michael, the parish priest, noticed David's hollow cheeks and Sarah's worn clothes, but when he tried to ask, they brushed him off with polite smiles. By the first week of August, the cupboards were nearly bare. The mortgage company threatened foreclosure. The phone line had been cut. On August 10th, Sarah opened every cabinet, desperate to find something, anything, for dinner. She found half a jar of peanut butter, a handful of flour, and a box of herbal tea. That night, she mashed the peanut butter with stale bread crusts, called it a special recipe, and served it with forced cheer. Her children ate quietly, though Emily noticed her mother's plate was empty. Mom, you're not eating, she said. Sarah smiled weakly. I'm just not hungry. In truth, she was starving, saving her share for David, who would come home late again, tired and defeated. It was a moment no parent ever forgets. The sound of your child asking why there's no food in the fridge, why their stomach hurts, whether you might die from hunger. Sarah tucked her children into bed that night with a prayer whispered into the dark. She didn't know if God was listening. She didn't know if heaven even saw families like hers anymore. But as she lay awake staring at the cracked ceiling, she resolved one thing. The next morning, she would do what her pride had long resisted. She would take her children by the hand, walk them to the rectory, and ask for help. That choice, humble, desperate, and born from a mother's love, was the step that would open the door to the extraordinary. By the second week of August, the Miller household had crossed an invisible line, the line between struggling and starving. Hunger wasn't just a passing discomfort anymore. It had become the rhythm of their days, the shadow in every room. On Monday morning, Sarah opened the refrigerator, hoping against hope. The light flicked on, but the shelves stared back at her with nothing more than a jar of mustard, half a stick of butter, and a carton of eggs long past expiration. She checked the cupboards next. Flour dust in the bottom of a bag, a box of tea bags, one can of green beans, dented and almost forgotten. She lined everything up on the counter like a soldier taking inventory before a battle. Emily, standing quietly by the doorframe, whispered, Mom, is that all we have? Sarah forced a smile. "It's enough for today," she said, though the pit in her stomach told her otherwise. That night, she boiled the green beans with a little flour, turning it into a watery stew. She ladled bowls for the children and set them down like they were part of some new recipe passed down from her grandmother. "Try this," she said brightly. "It's something special." Emily ate in silence, but her eyes didn't miss the empty plate in front of her mother. "Mom, you didn't take any," she said softly. Sarah waved it off. "I'm not hungry." But she was. Her body ached for food, and still she saved her portion for David, who would return later that evening with nothing more than tired apologies. Tuesday was worse. Breakfast was hot tea with a spoonful of sugar, the last they had, for lunch. Sarah found the hardened crust of a loaf buried in the freezer. She scraped the last of the peanut butter from the jar, spread it thin, and cut the pieces into thirds. Jacob ate quickly, then clutched his stomach. "It hurts today," he murmured, trying not to cry. Lily, too young to hide her need, sobbed openly. She asked over and over for cereal, for yogurt, for anything that might fill her. David came home late again, his face lined with exhaustion. "No work," he admitted, collapsing into the chair at the kitchen table. "They said maybe next week. Maybe." Sarah wanted to scream. Next week was too far away. Next week. Her children might not even have the strength to play. Instead, she put a hand on his shoulder. "We'll make it somehow," she whispered, though she no longer knew how. That night, after putting the kids to bed, Sarah sat on the floor of the kitchen and cried quietly into her hands. Pride had kept her from admitting the truth to anyone, to the neighbors. She smiled and waved. At church, she stood tall, pretending everything was fine. But inside, she was collapsing. "God," she whispered into the silence, "if you can see us, if you can hear me, please help my children." Wednesday morning dawned heavy and hot. The children woke sluggish, their eyes dull, their voices faint. Sarah gave them cups of tea, calling it a special breakfast, though the sweetness of sugar was gone. Emily tried to drink hers slowly, pretending to enjoy it while Jacob pushed his cup away, whispering, "It's not food." Then around 10, Jacob swayed where he stood. His knees buckled and he fell. Panic surged through Sarah's chest as she caught him. His small frame felt impossibly light. For a terrifying second, she saw not her son, but a fragile bird. The metallic taste of her own hunger turned to ash in her mouth. "I'm fine," he insisted weakly. "Just dizzy." But the truth was clear. 3 days without real nourishment had pushed their small bodies past the limit. Emily, old enough to ask the questions her parents feared, finally broke the silence. "Mom, why don't we have food anymore? What's going to happen to us? Are we going to die?" Sarah froze, her throat closing around the words she couldn't say. She pulled her daughter close, whispering only, "I won't let that happen. I promise." But promises don't fill stomachs. By noon, Sarah knew she couldn't hide behind her pride any longer. She washed her children's faces, tied Lily's hair into a little ponytail, and told them they were going for a walk. Inside, her heart was breaking. She had never asked anyone for help in her life. She and David had always been the givers, the dependable ones. But now, Now her children's hollow eyes left her no choice. When she stepped out the door, neighbors glimpsed her leading 3 children down Maple Street. Most thought nothing of it. Just a mother walking her kids on a summer afternoon. No one knew that inside her purse sat exactly $3.25 in change, all the money left in the house. No one knew that she was heading towards St. Joseph's Rectory, ready to say the words that would shatter her pride. My children haven't eaten in 3 days. Sarah Miller had reached the breaking point. What she could not know was that this act of humility, the simple decision to knock on a church door, would not end in humiliation, but in a chain of events that would defy every logical explanation. It was the darkest hour for the Millers. And yet, as history often shows, the darkest hour comes just before the dawn. When Sarah Miller reached the old brick rectory of St. Joseph's, her hands were trembling. She had walked the 2 blocks from Maple Street with her 3 children trailing quietly at her side, each step heavy with humiliation and fear. Emily clutched Lily's doll. Jacob dragged his shoes along the sidewalk, and Sarah held their small hands as if they were her last tethered to courage. The rectory was not an imposing place, just a simple 2-story house beside the church, its white shutters peeling from years of Kansas summers. Yet to Sarah, standing at the gate, it felt like a wall she was about to break through. She swallowed hard and rang the bell. Inside, Father Michael was finishing his afternoon nap. At 62, the priest had served Willow Creek for over 2 decades. His hair had gone silver, his face lined from years of listening more than speaking. He was known for his gentle homilies, his habit of visiting shut-ins, and his uncanny ability to notice what others ignored. When the doorbell rang, he rose, slipped on his glasses, and shuffled to the entryway. The moment he opened the door, he felt it, a weight in the air, a plea unspoken. There stood Sarah, pale, her lips pressed tight, her 3 children clinging close. He didn't need words. Their hollow faces told the story. "Father," she began, her voice breaking. "We haven't eaten in 3 days. My children are hungry. I don't know where else to go." The words hung in the air like a confession, shattering the silence of the rectory. Father Michael stepped aside immediately. "Come in, my dear. Bring the children." He led them into his modest living room with worn furniture and a crucifix on the wall. The children sat on the couch, wide-eyed and silent. The priest disappeared into the kitchen and returned with a tray, a pitcher of milk, a plate of crackers, and a jar of peanut butter. "Here, little ones, eat first." Emily hesitated at first, glancing at her mother, but Father Michael urged her with a nod. Within minutes, the children were devouring the food with a hunger that was painful to watch. Jacob's small hands shook as he scooped peanut butter onto crackers. Lily clutched her cup of milk like it was treasure. Even Emily, who tried to act grown up, couldn't hide her relief. Sarah sat quietly, tears streaming down her cheeks. Watching her children eat, she felt both gratitude and shame, as if she had failed them. Father Michael noticed and gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "You have nothing to be ashamed of. Asking for help is not weakness, it's love." Bit by bit, Sarah told him everything. The unpaid invoices, the fire that destroyed the workshop, the insurance company's refusal, David's endless search for work. She spoke of the bills piling on the counter, of selling her wedding ring, of the empty cupboards. Her voice cracked when she admitted, "I thought I could protect them from this, but I can't anymore." Father Michael listened without interruption, his eyes kind, but grave. He had heard many confessions in his lifetime, but this was different. This was not about sin. This was about survival. When Sarah finished, he leaned forward. "Sarah, you and your children are not alone. The parish has a small emergency fund. It is meant exactly for situations like this." He walked to a small wooden cabinet, opened a drawer, and pulled out an envelope. Inside was $200 in cash collected from parishioners for those in need. He pressed it into Sarah's hands. She shook her head, overwhelmed. "Father, I can't." "Yes, you can." He interrupted gently. "This is not charity in the sense of pity. This is community. Even Jesus accepted food from his friends. Take it and use it to feed your children tonight." Her fingers closed around the envelope. It felt heavier than money. It felt like a lifeline. But Father Michael knew $200 would not solve everything. "I will call around," he said firmly. "There may be someone who needs a carpenter, and if not, we will find other ways. What matters now is that your family has food." Sarah could hardly speak. "How do I thank you by keeping faith?" The priest replied simply, "By remembering that even in the darkest times, God sees you. He does not forget his children." When Sarah left the rectory that afternoon, her 3 children walked beside her, their bellies no longer aching, their faces brighter. In her hand, she held the envelope, though she still couldn't quite believe it. She had walked through that door trembling with shame. She walked out carrying something else, the first flicker of hope. Yet none of them knew that this simple act of courage, one mother knocking on a priest's door, was only the beginning. What awaited them in the hours ahead would make even this moment of relief seem small. Late that afternoon, Sarah Miller walked into the Walmart on the edge of Willow Creek with her 3 children at her side. She gripped the envelope Father Michael had pressed into her hand as if it were made of gold. $200 more money than she had seen in weeks, felt both like abundance and like a fragile rope keeping them from falling deeper into despair. The sliding glass doors whooshed open and cool air swept over them for Emily, Jacob, and little Lily. Stepping into the store was like stepping into another world. The bright lights, the neatly stacked shelves, the endless rows of food. It was overwhelming. They hadn't been in a grocery store for weeks, and now their wide eyes darted from one aisle to another as if they had been transported into a dream. Sarah had prepared a list carefully at home. Bread, milk, rice, pasta, canned goods, fresh fruit, and vegetables. Nothing extra, no luxuries, just enough to stretch for a week. She clutched the list like a compass, determined not to wander. Still, the children couldn't help themselves. "Mom, can we get yogurt?" Jacob whispered hopefully. Emily pointed to apples in the produce section. "These look so good." And Lily, tugging at her mother's sleeve, whispered with all the urgency of a 4-year-old. "Cookies, Mama, please, cookies." Sarah's heart ached. For weeks, she had denied them every small joy. She nodded once. "We'll see, but only if we can afford it." They moved aisle by aisle, filling the cart with basics: a gallon of milk, a bag of rice, pasta, peanut butter, frozen vegetables. Sarah compared prices, choosing generic brands, checking totals in her head with every item. By the time they reached the checkout line, the cart was modest but full: bread, eggs, cereal, some chicken, apples, a few small treats. At the register, Sarah's chest tightened. She had been adding the numbers in her mind. The total would be close to 1. That would leave just a few dollars for emergencies. She pulled the bills from the envelope and smoothed them nervously on the counter. The cashier, a kind, middle-aged woman named Linda, who had seen the family before, began scanning items. "How are you doing today?" she asked, smiling at the kids. "We're okay," Sarah said softly, though her eyes betrayed the tension she felt. The scanner beeped item after item. Sarah's pulse quickened as the total climbed: 47, 62, 83, 19, 128, 145. Her breath caught when it passed $150. Finally, the screen flashed the final number. Pause 187.45. Sarah's stomach dropped. She had been right. It was nearly the whole envelope. She exhaled shakily, ready to hand over the money. But then something happened. The cashier frowned, tapping the screen. "That's strange," she muttered. "The register is now showing." Longer pause. 72.45. Sarah blinked. "Excuse me." Linda shook her head. "Must be a glitch. Let me scan it all again." She cleared the screen and rescanned every item carefully, her hands moving slower this time. Again, the total popped up: 72.45. "I don't understand," Linda whispered. "This machine has worked perfectly for years." She tried a third time deliberately. The result was the same. Finally, Linda looked at Sarah with wide eyes. "Well, I can't charge you more than what the register says. It's 72.45 today." Sarah's hands trembled as she handed over the cash. She almost couldn't breathe. She walked away with her children and her receipt, the cart full of groceries, and over $120 still in her envelope. But the miracle wasn't over. When she began unloading the bags into the car, Sarah noticed items she was certain she hadn't picked: a bottle of olive oil, a package of shredded cheese, a bar of chocolate, even jars of baby food Lily hadn't had in months. Her first instinct was panic. Had one of the children slipped things into the cart? "Emily, Jacob, did you put these in?" They shook their heads. Lily stared wide-eyed, clutching her doll. Sarah emptied every bag. The truth was undeniable. There were at least $50 worth of extra food, and she had no memory of putting them there. She sat down hard on the curb outside the store, the Kansas sun lowering behind her. Her children gathered around, tugging at the grocery bags, delighted by the sudden abundance. For Sarah, the world tilted. The rules she had lived by: work hard, pay your bills, expect nothing, were dissolving. It was as if the rigid laws of physics had simply stepped aside. Just for a moment. Just for her. That night, for the first time in 3 days, the Miller family sat down to a real dinner. Sarah cooked pasta with cheese, served fresh salad, poured milk into glasses. Jacob devoured his plate. Emily ate in silence, tears in her eyes. Little Lily, sticky with yogurt and crumbs of cookie, laughed for the first time in weeks. David came home late, his face weary as ever. But when he stepped into the kitchen and saw the table covered with food, he stopped in his tracks. Where did all this come from?" Sarah explained the envelope, the store, the glitch, the extra food. David stared at her in disbelief. "You're saying you paid $72 for all this?" He asked it 3 times, as if repeating it might make it less impossible. Sarah nodded. Her eyes welled. "I don't know how to explain it." For that evening, Explanations didn't matter. What mattered was the sound of forks on plates, the giggles of children, and the quiet sobs of two parents who had carried the unbearable, and for the first time in months, felt the weight lift. If only for a moment. But deep in Sarah's chest, one thought pulsed like a heartbeat. This isn't just luck. Something greater is at work here. And she was right. The strange grace of that supermarket was only the first whisper of a miracle that had only begun. That Wednesday night, the Miller home was alive with sounds it hadn't known in months. Laughter, clinking glasses, the chatter of children too busy eating to complain. The kitchen table, usually bare, was now filled with plates of pasta, salad, and warm bread. For the first time in days, the family ate until their stomachs were full. When dinner ended, David gave Jacob a piggyback ride down the hall. Emily washed dishes beside her mother, and little Lily sang to her doll. The house, so long, heavy with silence, seemed to breathe again. But when the children were finally tucked into bed and the dishes set to dry, quiet returned. David and Sarah sat together in the small living room, side by side on a sagging couch. A single lamp lit the space, casting a soft glow over the worn carpet and shelves lined with old family photos. Outside, the Kansas night was heavy with crickets. Inside, they talked in hushed voices. $772. David repeated for the fourth time, shaking his head. I can't wrap my mind around it. There's no way that machine made the same mistake 3 times. Sarah folded her hands in her lap. And the food we didn't even buy. The baby jars. The chocolate. David. How can that be explained? He leaned back, exhausted. But his eyes softened when they met hers. Maybe it's luck. Sarah hesitated. Her voice dropped to a whisper. Or maybe it's something more. The words hung between them. Then, at 9:15 p.m., something shifted in the room. First, it was the air. A sudden coolness swept through the living room. Though no windows were open, the lamp beside them flickered. And then came the fragrance, sweet, unmistakable, like roses blooming in spring. Roses, in a Kansas living room, in August. David sat up straight. Do you smell that? She asked. Before he could answer, a light began to shimmer in the corner near the bookshelf. At first, it was faint, like the glow of moonlight through water, but it grew brighter and softer at the same time, filling the room without blinding their eyes. David gripped Sarah's hand. The light shifted, shaped itself, and slowly became a figure. A woman stood before them, radiant yet gentle, clothed in a flowing white robe with a mantle of sky blue. Her hair was chestnut, her face serene, her eyes luminous with a tenderness that seemed to pierce their very souls. Her hands were joined in prayer, and from her whole being emanated a glow that warmed the room with peace. Sarah's knees gave way. She fell to the carpet, trembling. David dropped beside her, unable to move or look away. Then the woman spoke, and her voice was not sound, but music that resonated in their hearts more than in their ears. Do not be afraid. My children, I am Mary, the mother of Jesus, and your mother in faith. Sarah gasped, covering her mouth with her hands. Tears streamed down her face. David, usually so steady, shook like a boy. Mary's gaze swept over them with infinite compassion. I have heard your prayers. I have seen your suffering. I was with you when you had nothing to feed your children, and I was with you when the bread appeared on your table tonight. You are not abandoned. Sarah sobbed openly, words tumbling out. Was it you at the store? The groceries, the receipt. Mary smiled with a radiance that filled the room. A mother does not ignore her children when they cry out. What you received was but a sign, proof that heaven sees you, and more is yet to come. David bowed his head, tears falling freely. But why us? We are nobody. Just a family in Kansas. Mary's answer was gentle. It is in the ordinary homes in the smallest towns that God's love is revealed most powerfully. You held on to each other when everything else was stripped away. You chose love over pride. That is why heaven has come to you. Her words wrapped around them like a blanket. Then she turned to Sarah. Your faith and courage as a mother will be rewarded. Your children will grow strong, not only in body but in compassion. They will understand others' pain because they have known it themselves. Turning to David, she continued, your hands, though weary, will build again. Work will be given to you soon, and it will provide not only for your family, but for others as well. For nearly 10 minutes, the room glowed with her presence. The Millers remained kneeling, hearts pounding, unable to look away. Finally, Mary raised her hands in blessing. Remember, she said softly, you are loved. Share what you have seen. Let your story bring hope. I will always be near. Slowly on, the light began to fade. The fragrance of roses lingered even as the figure dissolved into the quiet night. When it was gone, silence returned. Yet, it was no longer empty. Sarah and David stayed on their knees long after, their hands clasped, tears streaming, their souls overwhelmed. Neither dared to speak for fear the sacred moment might vanish if they broke it with words. It was only when Emily crept from her bedroom and whispered, Mom, Dad, why are you crying? That Sarah realized hours had passed. She gathered her daughter in her arms, her voice trembling but steady. Because, sweetheart, tonight we met someone very special, and nothing will ever be the same again. The morning after the apparition, Sarah woke with a strange calm. For the first time in months, she hadn't spent the night twisting in worry about bills or food. The scent of roses still lingered faintly in the air, clinging to the curtains and the old carpet. At first, she wondered if it had all been a dream, but when she walked into the kitchen, her doubts shattered. The pantry door, which she remembered closing the night before, stood slightly ajar. Inside, shelves that had been half empty were now full. Cans of vegetables lined neatly in rows, boxes of cereal, a bag of flour, packages of chicken sealed as if fresh from the store. Sarah's knees nearly buckled. She called David, and together they stared in silence at the abundance that hadn't been there hours earlier. Sarah, David whispered, we didn't buy this. She touched the flour, the cans, the bread, as though they might disappear if she blinked. No, she answered softly. We didn't, but someone else did. That day, when the children came into the kitchen, their eyes lit up as if Christmas had arrived in August. Emily grabbed an apple, biting into it with tears in her eyes. Jacob shouted, We have food again. Little Lily clapped her hands, pointing to the cookies on the counter. And the miracles didn't stop there. On Thursday, David left early to knock on doors once more. But this time, something was different. He carried with him the memory of Mary's words. Your hands will build again. Instead of dread, he felt a quiet confidence. He stopped at Barbier and Sons, a woodworking company that had turned him down months earlier. To his shock, the owner greeted him with a smile. David, you came at the right time, the man said. I just signed a contract to restore an old farmhouse. I need someone who knows antique work. It starts Monday. 6 months' pay. David could hardly speak. He shook the man's hand with trembling fingers, knowing in his heart this was no coincidence. Meanwhile, at home, Sarah discovered more surprises. She opened the fridge to find jars of baby food she hadn't bought. A box of hot cocoa mix sat on the counter, though she had never placed it there. Even the laundry basket seemed touched. Clothes that had been too worn suddenly appeared patched, as if lovingly repaired. Friday afternoon. Emily came home from school carrying a brand new backpack stuffed with supplies, pencils, notebooks, markers, everything on her back-to-school list. A lady gave it to me. She explained. She said her name was Mary, and that she wanted me to be ready for class. Sarah's breath caught. There was no Mary on the school run that anyone knew of. That same evening, Jacob burst into the house with a wide grin. Look what I found on my desk. He held up a stack of books, exactly the titles on his summer reading list, and inside the cover of one was a note written in delicate golden ink. For Jacob with love, Mary. The most startling moment came from little Lily. At dinner, she looked up from her plate and said in her matter-of-fact 4-year-old way, Mama, the pretty lady came to my room last night. She told me she loves us. She smelled like flowers. Sarah and David exchanged a glance, their hearts pounding. Lily had described the vision exactly, though they had told her nothing. By Saturday, the whole family was transformed. The children played with new energy, no longer weighed down by hunger. David, once worn by failure, carried himself taller, ready to work again. Sarah felt joy she hadn't known in years, though tears still came easily when she thought about what they had lived through. But the miracles weren't just for them. Neighbors began to notice the change. Mrs. Thompson from across the street remarked, Sarah, you look different, like you're glowing. At church, Father Michael saw the family sitting in the pew with a peace that radiated outward. He nodded knowingly, though he said nothing. That weekend, as the family gathered for a simple dinner, chicken, rice, and vegetables, Sarah folded her hands and whispered grace aloud. The children joined in, their voices small but strong. Thank you, Lord, she prayed, for reminding us we are never alone. The food, the job, the school supplies, these could be dismissed as coincidences by outsiders. But for the Millers, each moment was proof. Proof that what they had seen in their living room was real. Proof that the mother who had appeared to them was still near, watching, providing, guiding. And deep inside, both Sarah and David knew this was only the beginning. By the time Sunday arrived, word had quietly begun to spread around Willow Creek. People noticed things they couldn't ignore. The Miller children, once pale and withdrawn, now arrived at Mass with bright eyes and new school supplies. David, who had spent months walking the streets in silence, carried himself with renewed strength, speaking to neighbors again with a confidence they hadn't seen since before the fire. And Sarah, her face, once marked by exhaustion, seemed almost luminous. That Sunday was August 15th, The Feast of the Assumption. Saint Joseph's church was filled with parishioners, the smell of polished wood and candle wax lingering in the air. Father Michael stood at the altar and spoke with unusual fervor. Mary, the mother of Jesus, does not forget families in need. She walks with us in our struggles. She bends low to hear our cries. As he preached, Sarah sat in the pew with her children, her heart pounding. Every word seemed aimed at her family. When she glanced sideways, she noticed heads turning. People were watching her, watching them with a mix of curiosity and something else, wonder. It was as if the grace that had flooded their small living room couldn't be contained by four walls. It was now leaking out, spilling onto the church lawn, touching everyone it passed. After Mass, the crowd spilled out onto the church lawn, exchanging greetings as usual. But then something different happened. Mrs. Henderson, a retired teacher, approached Sarah. "Honey," she said gently, "I don't know why, but for 3 nights, I've dreamed of a beautiful lady dressed in blue, in my dream." She kept saying, "Help Sarah's family." So here, she pressed an envelope into Sarah's hands. Inside was $500 in cash. Sarah nearly dropped it, tears flooding her eyes. Others followed. John Matthews, a retired carpenter, offered David his old set of tools, polished and ready. "I've been keeping these in my garage for years. Don't know why, but I feel like you're meant to have them now." Another woman, Mrs. Carter, leaned down to Sarah. "If you ever need someone to watch the kids while you work, I'll do it. I can't explain it, but I feel like God is nudging me." One by one, townspeople approached, some shy, some bold, all with the same strange urgency. They had felt dreams, stirrings, whispers in prayer, compelling them to reach out to the Miller family. By the time Sarah and David walked their children home, they carried more than groceries and tools. They carried the weight of a community suddenly mobilized around them. That afternoon, the Miller home was busier than it had been in years. Neighbors dropped off casseroles and bags of fresh produce. A local farmer offered to supply eggs each week. One young couple even left a gift card on their porch without a note. It was as though invisible hands were weaving together a net to catch them. And yet, the strangest moment still came in private. That night, as Sarah tucked Lily into bed, the little girl whispered, "Mommy, the pretty lady told me we're safe now." She kissed my forehead. Sarah froze, her heart pounding. Lily's eyes sparkled with innocent certainty. Meanwhile, Emily confided in her mother. "I think I saw her, too, yesterday, when I was doing my homework. I smelled roses, and I felt, I don't know, like someone was standing right behind me." Jacob, usually the quiet one, surprised everyone at dinner by saying, "I'm not scared anymore. I think she's watching over us." The children's words spread quickly among relatives, neighbors, and schoolmates. Soon, whispers traveled through the town. The Millers have seen something holy. Not everyone believed. Of course, some dismissed it as exaggeration or coincidence or desperation coloring their perception. But others, especially those who had also felt strange nudges, dreams, or sense of roses, began to wonder. By midweek, Father Michael's phone began ringing with calls from parishioners. "Father, I had the same dream. Father, I smelled roses in my kitchen last night. Father, is it possible the priest, cautious but moved, advised everyone the same? Pray. Stay close to Christ. And if Mary is truly among us, the fruits will reveal it. For the Millers, the fruits were undeniable. Each day brought new provisions, new kindnesses. Sarah no longer worried about the next meal. David prepared to start his new job, his toolbox already full. The children returned to school with everything they needed, their heads held high. And perhaps most powerful of all, the town itself began to change. Neighbors who hadn't spoken in years offered help to one another. Strained families began showing up at church again. Acts of generosity multiplied like sparks from a single flame. It was as if the grace that had entered the Miller household refused to stay confined. It spilled out onto Maple Street, then into pews, then across the town itself. And for the first time in decades, Willow Creek buzzed with a sense of expectation. Something was happening, something that no one could quite explain, but no one could deny. It was early Sunday morning, August 16th, when the Miller family was awakened by something extraordinary. At first, Sarah thought it was a dream. The fragrance of roses so strong it seemed to seep through the very walls. But then David stirred beside her, sniffed the air, and whispered, "Do you smell that?" Moments later, the scent spread through every corner of the house, sweet and unmistakable. The children came padding into the living room, their eyes wide. "Mom," Emily whispered, "it's her. She's here again." They gathered in the living room just as they had 3 nights earlier, and once more the air shifted. The light began softly, almost like dawn pressing through the curtains. Then it grew bright and golden, filling the room with warmth that soothed every fear in their hearts. And then she was there. Mary stood before them again, radiant in white with her mantle of blue, her face aglow with the same tenderness that had undone them before. But this time she did not remain distant. She moved closer, her steps as silent as breath, until she stood among them like a mother among her children. "My beloved children," she said, her voice like music. "You have endured trial with faith. You have placed love before pride. For this you are blessed." She placed her hand gently on David's shoulder. He trembled as though electricity ran through his veins. "David," she said, "use will build again, not only for your family, but for others. Through your craft, you will restore dignity to those who have lost it. One day, you will teach the young and the broken, giving them hope through the work of their hands." Tears blurred David's vision. He whispered, "I don't deserve this." Mary smiled, her gaze steady. "Grace is never deserved. It is given." Then she turned to Sarah, who was already on her knees, tears streaming down her face. "Sarah, your courage as a mother has carried your family through the valley of despair. Your faith will become a light for other women. You will gather families in need, help them rise from their suffering, and remind them that no one is ever abandoned by God. You will be a mother not only to your children, but to many." Sarah sobbed openly, shaking her head. "How could I do that? I have nothing." "You have everything," Mary answered softly. "You have love, and love, when offered freely, multiplies." Then, bending low, Mary touched the heads of the 3 children. Emily gasped softly. Jacob stared in wonder, and little Lily giggled as though tickled by sunlight. "Emily," Mary said, Your heart for others will lead you to walk beside the hurting. You will grow into a woman who gives strength to the weak. Jacob. You will one day ease the suffering of many through healing hands. The compassion born in hunger will guide your path. And Lily, my little one, your joy will remind all who meet you that God's love is near, even in the darkest hours. The children stared wide-eyed, not fully understanding, but sensing the weight of her words. Finally, Mary's gaze encompassed them all. What you have received, do not keep for yourselves. Share it. Tell your story. Let others know that heaven is not far, that God's love is alive. This house will be a testimony, and your lives a witness. Many will find hope because of you. Her words wrapped around them like fire and light. For a long moment, no one spoke. The only sound was Lily whispering, "Don't go," her small fingers reaching toward the shining mantle. Mary bent low and kissed the child's forehead. Then she straightened, raising her hands in blessing. "I will always be near. When you doubt, remember the roses. When you despair, remember this night." Slowly, the light began to fade. The glow receded, leaving the ordinary living room once more. But it no longer felt ordinary. The fragrance of roses lingered, clinging to the air long after the vision was gone. The Millers remained kneeling in silence, their hearts overwhelmed, their tears flowing freely. David finally broke the stillness. She gave us a mission." Sarah gripped his hand, her voice trembling but firm. "Then we will do it. Whatever it costs, we will do it." And in that moment, the family understood. What had begun as survival was now a calling. They were no longer just a family rescued from hunger. They had become witnesses, chosen to carry a message of hope far beyond Willow Creek. 5 years later, the little house on Maple Street looked nothing like the place it once was. The siding had been repaired, the yard trimmed neatly, the faded blue paint, once a symbol of their decay, was gone, replaced by a bright, hopeful yellow. The house itself, once heavy with silence, now breathed with laughter spilling from the open windows. What had once been a place of hunger and despair had become a beacon in Willow Creek and far beyond. David Miller stood in the backyard where his old workshop had burned to the ground. In its place now rose a large wooden structure buzzing with activity. It wasn't just his shop anymore. It was a training center. Young men and women, some who had dropped out of high school, others who had struggled with addiction or unemployment, gathered each week to learn the craft of woodworking. Under David's guidance, they restored antique furniture, built cabinets, and even crafted pews for churches in nearby towns. "This place gave me my life back," one young trainee admitted to a local reporter. "Mr. Miller didn't just teach me how to use a saw. He taught me I still had worth." The center, called Hands of Hope Workshop, had become a model for vocational training across the Midwest. And David, once a man brought to his knees by loss, now carried himself with quiet authority, his reputation as a master craftsman matched only by his role as a mentor. Inside the house, Sarah was just as busy. After the apparitions, she had vowed to live out the calling Mary had given her. She started small, hosting neighborhood families in her living room, sharing meals, listening to their struggles. But the work grew quickly. Donations arrived, volunteers stepped in, and soon an official nonprofit was born. Hope for Families. What began with a few bags of groceries now served hundreds of families across Kansas every year. They provided food, counseling, tutoring for children, and support groups for struggling parents. Sarah was often invited to conferences, both Catholic and interfaith, to speak about resilience, faith, and the power of community. She always began her talks the same way. 5 years ago, I was a mother with nothing in my cupboards but desperation. Today, I am here to tell you that God never abandons his children. The Miller children had grown, each walking the path Mary had foretold. Emily, now 17, had chosen to study social work. "I want to help families the way people helped us," she told her guidance counselor. She volunteered every summer at her mother's nonprofit, mentoring younger kids who faced the same shame she once hid behind excuses. Jacob, 15, carried books on biology and anatomy everywhere he went. His dream was medicine. "I want to be a doctor," he said simply, "so no one has to feel helpless when their body is in pain." His compassion, born in those days of hunger, was shaping him into a healer. And little Lily, no longer little, was 9, full of energy and joy. Teachers often commented on her radiant kindness, the way she comforted children who felt left out. More than once, she startled her parents with childlike but profound words. "Mama, the lady still comes sometimes. Not where you can see her, but I can feel her near." The town of Willow Creek itself had changed. St. Joseph's Church overflowed on Sundays. Acts of charity multiplied among neighbors. Strangers passing through sometimes remarked, "There's something different here. People actually care about each other." News of the Miller story had traveled far. Articles appeared in diocesan newspapers, then in national magazines. Documentaries were filmed. Pilgrims began arriving quietly, wanting to see the little house where roses had once filled the air, where heaven had bent close to touch an ordinary American family. Some came out of curiosity, others in desperation, hoping for healing or guidance. Many left claiming they had experienced peace they couldn't explain. And more than a few conversions took place at the humble parish of St. Joseph's. Father Michael, now older and slower, had carefully documented everything: the apparitions, the miracles of provision, the transformation of the family and the town. His dossier was submitted to the diocese, where an investigation began. The church moved cautiously, but the evidence was compelling. Consistent testimony, widespread fruits, lives permanently changed. Standing in their living room one evening, Sarah and David looked around at the photographs lining the walls. Smiling students from the workshop, families helped through hope for families, their own children growing tall. "Can you believe," Sarah whispered, "what began with 3 days of hunger has turned into this?" David pulled her close, shaking his head in wonder. "We thought we were abandoned, but we were being prepared." And perhaps that was the truest miracle of all, that in a small Kansas town, a family on the edge of collapse had not only been rescued, but transformed into a source of hope for thousands. The story of the Millers, once whispered, was now told in churches, schools, and living rooms across America. It was no longer just about one family's survival. It had become a testimony, living proof that even in the darkest nights, heaven still breaks through. And the fragrance of roses, sometimes on quiet evenings, neighbors swore they smelled it drifting across Maple Street, carried on the wind. And so the Miller's journey reminds us of something timeless, that miracles are not locked away in ancient stories, but still unfold today in quiet towns, in ordinary homes, and in the lives of those who dare to keep faith when everything else is lost. If this story touched your heart, let it remind you that hope is never far and that God's love is always nearer than we think. We invite you to like this video and subscribe to Touched by Grace so that more souls can hear stories of faith, hope, and miracles that continue to shine even in the darkest of times. Together, let's keep spreading the light.